The Meridian's observation deck hummed with the kind of nervous energy that preceded either breakthrough discoveries or spectacular diplomatic disasters. Dr. Alexis Reeves adjusted his collar for the 7th time in 10 minutes, watching the Zephyrian flagship materialize through the viewport like a fever dream made of living crystal and pulsing light. "Stop fidgeting," muttered Commander Torres from beside him. "You're making me seasick, and we're in space." "Sorry." Alexis forced his hands to stillness, though his mind continued racing through xenobiological protocols. "It's just that we're about to make first contact with a species that supposedly evolved emotional telepathy. Do you realize the implications for human psychology? The potential for you to overthink yourself into a panic attack." Torres raised an eyebrow. "Breathe, document. They're just aliens with pointy ears, not mind-reading overlords." The irony of that statement would haunt Alexis for weeks to come. The Zephyrian vessel defied conventional spacecraft design, its hull flowing like frozen music between geometric and organic forms. Bioluminescent conduits pulsed beneath translucent surfaces, and what appeared to be living gardens cascaded down its flanks in impossible spirals. As it drew closer, smaller craft detached like seeds from a dandelion, their movements too fluid to be purely mechanical. "Incoming transmission," announced Lieutenant Chen from the communications station. "They're requesting permission to board." "Granted," Torres replied, then leaned toward Alexis. "Remember, you're here as our xenobiology expert, not as a fanboy. Try to maintain some professional dignity." "I'll do my best not to geek out over their presumed cranial modifications," Alexis muttered, earning a snort of laughter from the commander. The docking bay filled with a sound like wind chimes caught in a gentle breeze as the Zephyrian shuttle settled onto the landing pad. Steam hissed from cooling vents, carrying an oddly pleasant scent of ozone and something floral that Alexis couldn't identify. The shuttle's hull rippled, revealing an opening that dilated like an iris. 3 figures emerged, moving with a grace that suggested either extensive zero-gravity training or fundamentally different muscle structure. They wore flowing garments that seemed to shift color with each step, and as they drew closer, Alexis felt his breath catch. They looked remarkably human, until you noticed the ears. Long, elegantly tapered, rising to delicate points that gave them an otherworldly beauty. But it was the central figure that commanded attention, not through any obvious display of authority, but through the way space itself seemed to bend around her presence. Queen Valera of the Zephyrian Empire was, quite simply, stunning. Her dark hair cascaded past her shoulders, framing features that could have graced any human artist's conception of idealized beauty. But there was something in her eyes, an intensity that suggested she saw far more than the visible spectrum allowed. "Welcome aboard the Meridian," Commander Torres stepped forward, her diplomatic training evident in every measured word. "I am Commander Elena Torres, and this is Dr. Alexis Reeves, our xenobiology specialist." The Queen's gaze settled on Alexis with unsettling precision, as if she were reading text written across his forehead. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in his chest cavity. "Dr. Reeves." The translation device rendered her words in perfect English, though something in her tone suggested amusement. "Your neural patterns are quite colorful." "I'm sorry." Alexis blinked, momentarily thrown off guard. "Your emotional resonance," she clarified, tilting her head in a way that made her pointed ears more prominent. "Most intriguing. You are experiencing simultaneous excitement and terror, with underlying notes of professional fascination." "That's remarkably accurate," Alexis admitted, then immediately wondered if he should have. "Your people can actually read emotions through neural fields?" "Among other things," the Queen replied, and was that a hint of smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Your thoughts are not accessible to us, Dr. Reeves, but the emotional currents that drive them are quite apparent. Like watching someone conduct a symphony we cannot hear." Commander Torres cleared her throat. "Perhaps we should move to the conference room. I'm sure you have much to discuss." As they walked through the ship's corridors, Alexis found himself stealing glances at the Queen's entourage. The other Zephyrians moved with the same fluid grace, their elongated ears twitching occasionally as if catching sounds beyond human hearing range. One of them, apparently noticing his scrutiny, offered what might have been a reassuring smile. "Your cranial appendages are quite remarkable," Alexis said, attempting diplomatic conversation. "The evolutionary advantages must be significant." The entire Zephyrian party stopped walking. Queen Valera turned to face him, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched long enough for Alexis to realize he had said something terribly, horribly wrong. "Cranial appendages," she repeated slowly. "Your ears," he clarified, gesturing vaguely. "I assume they're adapted for enhanced auditory processing. The extended surface area would allow for greater sensitivity to." The Queen burst into laughter. Not the polite chuckle of diplomatic courtesy, but genuine, delighted laughter that filled the corridor with musical harmonies. Her companions joined in, their voices creating an impromptu chorus that would have made any human choir jealous. "Cranial appendages," she gasped between fits of laughter. "Oh, Dr. Reeves, you have just compared the most aesthetically prized feature of Zephyrian physiology to, what would be the equivalent, human nose hairs." Alexis felt his face burning with embarrassment. That wasn't my intention. I meant to express admiration for peace." The Queen held up a hand, still smiling broadly. "Your error is endearing, not offensive. We appreciate scientific curiosity, even when clumsily expressed." Commander Torres looked like she was trying very hard not to laugh. "Perhaps we should establish some basic cultural parameters before continuing." "An excellent suggestion," Queen Valera agreed. "Though I confess, Dr. Reeves' unique perspective on diplomatic protocol is refreshingly honest." They entered the conference room, where the Meridian's senior staff had assembled around a holographic display table. As the Zephyrians took their seats, Alexis noticed how their chairs automatically adjusted to accommodate their different physiology. Apparently, the ship's AI had been paying attention during the initial scans. "Now then," Commander Torres began, "we understand you represent the Zephyrian Empire's interests in establishing formal diplomatic relations with the Human Colonial Alliance." "That is partially correct," the Queen replied, her attention still fixed on Alexis with that unsettling intensity. "However, I find myself more interested in cultural exchange than political treaties." "What kind of cultural exchange?" asked Dr. Patterson, the ship's anthropologist. Queen Valera's smile took on a predatory quality that made several people shift uncomfortably in their seats. "I would like to invite Dr. Reeves to serve as a cultural liaison aboard our flagship." "I'm sorry, what?" Alexis nearly choked on the water he'd been sipping. "You possess a fascinating emotional complexity that would provide valuable insights into human psychology," she continued smoothly. "Consider it a research exchange program." "That's very flattering," Commander Torres interjected, "but Dr. Reeves has responsibilities here that are less important than advancing interspecies understanding," the Queen finished, her tone brooking no argument. "Unless, of course, the doctor objects to the assignment." All eyes turned to Alexis, who suddenly felt like a specimen under a microscope. The Queen's emotional reading abilities meant she could probably sense his internal conflict. Professional excitement warring with self-preservation instincts. "How long would this assignment last?" he asked carefully. "As long as proves mutually beneficial," she replied, which was exactly the kind of non-answer that made diplomatic agreements so nerve-wracking. "Dr. Reeves," Commander Torres said quietly, "you don't have to accept this. We can explore other options for cultural exchange." But Alexis found himself nodding before his rational mind could intervene. "I accept. When would you like me to transfer?" Queen Valera's smile became radiant. "Immediately. Your emotional patterns suggest you are already committed to this course of action, despite your surface reservations." "Great," Alexis muttered. "I'm apparently an open book to aliens with supernatural hearing aids." "Cranial appendages," the Queen corrected with obvious delight, and even the stoic Zephyrian guards cracked smiles. As the formal proceedings concluded and transfer arrangements were discussed, Alexis couldn't shake the feeling that he had just volunteered for something far more complex than a simple research exchange. Queen Valera's interest seemed too personal, too focused, for purely academic purposes. But then again, he reflected, watching her elegant gestures as she spoke with Commander Torres, maybe that was exactly what made it so intriguing. In a universe full of unknown possibilities, sometimes the most dangerous choice was also the most interesting one. Even if it involved trusting someone who could read his emotions like a favorite book, whether he wanted her to or not. The Zephyrian mothership's interior defied every assumption Alexis had made about alien architecture. Instead of sterile corridors and blinking control panels, he found himself walking through what resembled a living cathedral made of crystalline formations that pulsed with soft bioluminescence. The air itself seemed to shimmer with microscopic particles that responded to movement, creating trailing auroras behind every gesture. "Your accommodations are through here," announced Belthera, one of Queen Valera's attendants, her pointed ears twitching with what Alexis was beginning to recognize as suppressed amusement. "Try not to touch the walls directly until you've received proper biointegration protocols." "What happens if I touch them?" Alexis asked, then immediately wished he hadn't when several nearby Zephyrians exchanged knowing glances. "Nothing permanently damaging," Belthera replied with deliberate vagueness. "Though you might experience temporary synesthetic episodes. Last week, an untrained engineer from our mining division accidentally merged with a navigation console and spent 3 hours convinced he could taste hyperspace coordinates." "That's oddly specific," Alexis muttered, carefully keeping his hands clasped behind his back. They passed through a circular chamber where dozens of Zephyrians sat in meditation poses, their elongated ears glowing faintly with synchronized patterns. The harmony of their breathing created subtle resonances that made Alexis's teeth ache in a not entirely unpleasant way. "The truth singers," Belthera explained without being asked. "They maintain emotional equilibrium throughout the ship by vocalizing honest thoughts in harmonic frequencies." "What kind of honest thoughts?" "Whatever surfaces naturally. Today's primary theme appears to be mild irritation about the recycling systems backing up in Section 7. As if summoned by her words, a melodious voice drifted from the circle. "The waste management protocols require updating," and Administrator Kethnal's stubborn refusal to acknowledge the inefficiency stems from his romantic attachment to the engineer who designed them. Another voice joined the harmony. "We all know about Kethnal and engineer Mirasen, but pointing it out during truth singing feels unnecessarily gossipy." A third singer added, "Acknowledging the gossip makes us complicit in the gossip, which creates a feedback loop of emotional dishonesty." "This is what passes for maintenance reports?" Alexis asked. "Emotional transparency prevents the kind of interpersonal conflicts that once destroyed our civilization," Belthera replied matter-of-factly. "Though it does make staff meetings exceptionally awkward." They continued through corridors that branched and merged with organic irregularity, past chambers filled with incomprehensible technology that seemed to grow rather than be manufactured. Alexis noticed small creatures, about the size of house cats but with too many legs and scales that reflected impossible colors, scuttling between the crystal formations. "Maintenance symbionts," Belthera explained, following his gaze. "They keep the ship's biological systems healthy. Think of them as very specialized janitors with excellent taste in interior decorating." One of the creatures paused to regard Alexis with multiple eyes arranged in a pattern that hurt to look at directly. It made a sound like wind chimes being gargled, then skittered away with obvious disdain. "I don't think it likes me. Turlex is particular about new scents. You smell like industrial soap and existential anxiety, which apparently offends his aesthetic sensibilities." "Great. I'm being judged by alien janitor pets." They arrived at a doorway that dilated open at their approach, revealing quarters that managed to be both luxurious and completely alien. The walls curved seamlessly into ceiling and floor, creating a pod-like space filled with furniture that seemed to have grown from the deck. Bioluminescent panels provided warm, adjustable lighting, and what appeared to be a small garden occupied one corner, complete with plants that moved with their own internal rhythms. "The Queen has requested your presence for the evening meal," Belthera announced. "Fair warning, our dining customs may seem unusual to human sensibilities." "How unusual are we talking?" "Nothing that will permanently damage your digestive system," she replied with that same careful vagueness that was becoming annoyingly familiar. "Though you might want to practice emotional regulation techniques. Our food responds to the consumer's psychological state." Before Alexis could ask for clarification, she was gone, leaving him alone with furniture that seemed to be watching him expectantly. He spent the next hour exploring his quarters and trying not to accidentally activate anything important. The bed, if it was a bed, adjusted its firmness based on where he sat, while the walls displayed shifting patterns that seemed to respond to his mood. When he felt frustrated by the lack of familiar technology, the patterns turned red and spiky. When he relaxed, they shifted to soothing blues and greens. A soft chime indicated someone's arrival, and the door dilated to reveal Queen Valera herself, no longer wearing the formal robes of their first meeting. Instead, she wore a flowing garment that seemed to be woven from starlight and shadow, complementing the elegant sweep of her ears and the subtle luminescence of her skin. "Dr. Reeves," she said, and he could hear the smile in her voice even before seeing her expression. "How are you finding your accommodations?" "Educational," he replied honestly. "Though I'm afraid I might have insulted your maintenance staff. Apparently, I smell like industrial soap and existential anxiety." Her laughter filled the small space with harmonics that made the walls pulse gently in response. "Turlex has strong opinions about personal hygiene. He once refused to clean the ambassadorial suite because the visiting diplomat used cologne with synthetic pheromones. I'll try to smell more naturally anxious in the future." "An admirable goal." She gestured toward the door. "Shall we? The dining hall awaits, and tonight's menu promises to be particularly responsive to emotional complexity." They walked through corridors that seemed different from the ones Alexis had traversed earlier, though he couldn't identify specific changes. The ship appeared to reconfigure itself constantly, like a living organism adapting to the needs of its inhabitants. "Velthera mentioned that your food responds to psychological states," he said. "Should I be concerned about accidentally poisoning myself with negative emotions?" "The opposite, actually. Our cuisine is designed to harmonize with the consumer's emotional spectrum, creating flavors that complement and enhance psychological well-being. Though the results can be unpredictable, with species that lack natural emotional regulation." "What's the worst-case scenario?" A visiting trade delegate from the hegemony once became so frustrated with treaty negotiations that his soup turned into what your people might call extremely spicy regret with overtones of professional disappointment. "That sounds awful." He claimed it was the most honest meal he'd ever eaten, though he requested antacids afterward. The dining hall turned out to be a vast chamber with a ceiling that opened directly to space, held back by an energy field that allowed them to dine under an alien starfield. Tables and chairs grew from the floor in organic clusters, accommodating groups of various sizes, while servers moved between them carrying trays of foods that defied easy categorization. Queen Valera led him to a small table near the center of the room, where two place settings waited with utensils that looked more like abstract sculptures than eating implements. "The key," she explained as they settled into chairs that molded themselves to their bodies, "is to approach the meal with emotional honesty. Trying to hide your feelings will only make the flavors confused and potentially inedible." A server approached. Another Zephyrian whose ears bore intricate jewelry that chimed softly with each movement. They placed bowls before each diner, filled with what appeared to be liquid starlight that swirled with its own internal weather patterns. "The opening course," Queen Valera announced. "It's called Truth Broth, and it will taste like your current emotional state." Alexis lifted the bowl carefully, noting how it warmed to match his body temperature. The liquid inside shifted from silver to pale gold as he brought it closer to his lips. The first sip tasted like curiosity with hints of nervousness and an underlying sweetness that he realized was excitement. It was unlike anything he'd ever experienced, as if emotions had been distilled into flavor profiles that his brain could somehow interpret. "This is incredible," he said, taking another sip. "It tastes like the feeling you get when you're about to discover something important." With subtle notes of romantic confusion and career anxiety, the Queen observed, sampling her own bowl. "Your emotional palette is quite complex, Dr. Reeves." Romantic confusion? Alexis nearly choked on his next sip. "The broth doesn't lie," she replied with obvious amusement. "Though I find your transparency refreshing. Most visitors try to suppress their feelings, which only makes the flavors muddled and unpleasant." The next course arrived. What looked like crystallized music served on plates that hummed with harmonic frequencies. Queen Valera demonstrated the proper eating technique, using the sculptural utensils to break off pieces that dissolved on the tongue like sophisticated memories. "This one reflects deeper psychological currents," she explained. "It might taste like childhood experiences or fundamental beliefs about the universe." Alexis took a cautious bite and was immediately transported to his grandmother's kitchen on Earth, the flavor somehow capturing not just the taste of her famous apple pie but the feeling of being 7 years old and completely secure in the knowledge that the adults would handle everything complicated. "Family memories," he said softly. "How is that possible?" "Emotional resonance operates on quantum levels," she replied. "Strong memories leave traces in neural patterns that our cuisine can detect and interpret. It's not mind reading, exactly, but something close to emotional archaeology." As the meal progressed through increasingly sophisticated courses, Alexis found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't expected. The food seemed to identify tensions he didn't even realize he carried, addressing them with flavors that soothed psychological knots he'd grown accustomed to ignoring. "You know," he said during a particularly pleasant course that tasted like the satisfaction of solving difficult equations, "your people's technology is remarkable, but it must make privacy nearly impossible." Queen Valera paused, her expression growing thoughtful. "Privacy, yes. That's something we sacrificed long ago in favor of honesty. Our ancestors believed that deception was the root of all conflict." "And was it?" "The wars ended," she replied simply. "But sometimes I wonder what we lost in the process. Your people's capacity for emotional mystery is fascinating to us. The ability to hide feelings, to surprise each other, to maintain secrets that aren't necessarily harmful. You make it sound romantic. Perhaps it is." She met his gaze directly, and for a moment, her usual composed demeanor seemed to crack slightly. "Tell me, Dr. Reeves, what is it like to love someone without them knowing the full depth of your feelings?" The question caught him completely off guard, and he felt his face heating with embarrassment. The dessert course, a confection that sparkled with its own internal light, suddenly tasted like vulnerability mixed with confusion and a sweetness he didn't want to examine too closely. "I wouldn't know," he said finally. "I've never been particularly good at hiding my feelings." "And yet," she replied with a knowing smile, "your emotional patterns suggest otherwise." The neural dampening headband looked like something designed by a committee of engineers who had never actually worn jewelry. Alexis turned it over in his hands, examining the crystalline nodes that were supposed to block emotional resonance frequencies, while Queen Valera watched with barely concealed amusement from her throne. "You realize," she said, her voice carrying those musical harmonics that made his chest vibrate, "that attempting to shield your emotions from us is rather like trying to hide a supernova behind a paper bag." "The principle should work," Alexis insisted, adjusting the device's neural interface contacts. "If I can generate a counter-frequency that disrupts your bioresonance detection, theoretically I should be able to mask my emotional output." "Theoretically," agreed Velthera from her position near the throne room's entrance. Though the last person who tried something similar ended up broadcasting his feelings to the entire ship. For 3 days, everyone within 50 meters experienced his passionate opinions about cafeteria food and his mother's disapproval of his career choices. "That's oddly specific." "He was my cousin," she replied with a shrug. "Engineering runs in the family, along with questionable decision-making." Alexis activated the device, feeling a slight tingling as the neural contacts made connection. The throne room's crystalline walls, which had been pulsing gently with ambient emotional resonance, suddenly dimmed to a steady neutral glow. Fascinating, Queen Valera leaned forward, her elegant ears twitching with interest. I can no longer sense your emotional state directly. It's like looking at a person-shaped void in the resonance field. Success. Alexis grinned triumphantly, then immediately regretted the expression when he realized how it might appear. However, she continued with a smile that suggested she was enjoying this far more than diplomatic protocol probably allowed. Your attempts at emotional concealment have made you approximately as subtle as a malfunctioning gravity generator. Your body language is now screaming everything your neural patterns were whispering before. She was right, he realized. Without the natural feedback loop of emotional resonance, he was overcompensating with physical gestures, facial expressions, and vocal inflections that probably made him look like he was performing in an amateur theatrical production. Additionally, Valthera added helpfully, the device appears to be causing some interesting side effects. Your hair is starting to glow. Alexis reached up to find that his hair was indeed emanating a soft blue-green luminescence that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. That's probably not medically advisable. Probably not, Queen Valera agreed. Though it does complement your eyes rather nicely. Before he could respond, the throne room's main entrance dilated to admit a group of Zephyrians whose formal robes and elaborate ear jewelry marked them as members of the Royal Council. Their expression suggested they had arrived with urgent business that would not appreciate interruption by glowing humans and their experimental headwear. Your Majesty, announced the lead counselor, whose ears bore enough metallic ornaments to serve as functional antennae, we must discuss the implications of your cultural exchange program. Queen Valera's posture shifted subtly, taking on the formal bearing of royalty receiving official business. Speak, Counselor Methvar. The human's presence aboard our flagship has created certain complications among the crew, Methvar continued, his gaze flicking briefly to Alexis before returning to the Queen. His emotional patterns are disrupting established resonance hierarchies. In what way, she asked, though something in her tone suggested she already knew the answer. His psychological complexity is creating harmonic interference in the Truth Singer's meditation sessions. Yesterday, their attempt to maintain emotional equilibrium resulted in a spontaneous chorus about the existential implications of interspecies attraction. Alexis felt his face burning with embarrassment, which unfortunately made his hair glow brighter. I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was causing problems. Additionally, another counselor interjected, the maintenance symbionts have begun exhibiting unusual behaviors. They appear to be decorating the corridors near your quarters with arrangements of bioluminescent fungi that form patterns resembling human facial features. That's oddly romantic for alien janitor pets, Alexis muttered. The real concern, Methvar continued, ignoring the interruption, is that your presence may be influencing Her Majesty's emotional state in ways that could affect crucial decisions regarding our people's future. The throne room fell silent except for the gentle humming of the ship's biological systems. Queen Valera's expression remained carefully neutral, but Alexis noticed her fingers tightening almost imperceptibly on her throne's armrests. Are you suggesting, she said with dangerous quiet, that I am incapable of maintaining professional objectivity in matters of state? We are suggesting, Methvar replied with the careful precision of someone navigating a minefield, that emotional transparency works both ways. Your resonance patterns regarding the human have become notable among those sensitive to such things. Which is everyone, Valthera added under her breath, earning sharp looks from several counselors. Queen Valera stood, her movements fluid despite what Alexis was beginning to recognize as barely controlled irritation. Dar. Reeves, would you be so kind as to remove that ridiculous device before it causes permanent damage to your neural chemistry? Alexis deactivated the headband, feeling immediate relief as normal sensation returned to his scalp. His hair stopped glowing, though it retained a faint shimmer that would probably take hours to fade completely. Now then, the Queen continued, addressing her counsel with the kind of tone that suggested they had overstepped important boundaries. Let me clarify something about the nature of leadership and emotional honesty. She began walking slowly around the assembled counselors, her presence somehow filling the vast throne room despite her relatively small stature. Our ancestors chose transparency over privacy because they believed that hidden emotions led to poor decisions. They were correct. But they also understood that acknowledging one's feelings is not the same as being controlled by them. Your Majesty, Methvar began, but she silenced him with a gesture. I am perfectly aware of my emotional responses to Dr. Reeves, she continued. I find his intellectual curiosity stimulating, his cultural perspectives enlightening, and his complete lack of diplomatic training refreshingly honest. I also find him physically attractive, which is hardly surprising given that his species shares enough physiological similarities with ours to trigger appropriate biological responses. Alexis wanted to disappear into the crystalline floor. Being discussed like a biological specimen in front of a royal council was not among his preferred ways to spend an afternoon. However, Queen Valera's voice took on an edge that made several counselors step backward. My personal feelings do not override my responsibilities to our people. If you believe otherwise, you underestimate both my self-control and my commitment to effective governance. We meant no disrespect, Methvar said hastily. We are merely concerned about potential complications. What complications? That I might make decisions based on emotion rather than logic. That I might compromise our people's interests for personal satisfaction. She paused directly in front of the lead counselor. Or are you concerned that I might choose to explore possibilities that our rigid adherence to emotional transparency has made impossible for generations? We don't understand, Your Majesty. Queen Valera returned to her throne, but remained standing. Dr. Reeves represents something we have lost, the capacity for emotional mystery. His people form relationships without complete knowledge of their partner's feelings. They experience uncertainty, surprise, the thrill of discovery. They can fall in love without knowing if that love is returned. That sounds terrifying, Velthara observed. It sounds wonderful, the Queen replied softly. When was the last time any of us experienced genuine surprise in a relationship? When did any of us have the joy of wondering about another person's feelings, of hoping, of taking emotional risks without certainty of the outcome? The counselors exchanged glances that Alexis was beginning to recognize as the Zephyrian equivalent of nervous fidgeting. Their ear jewelry created a subtle wind chime effect as they shifted position. Your Majesty, one of the younger counselors ventured, are you suggesting that emotional transparency has negative aspects? I am suggesting that absolute knowledge can be as limiting as ignorance. Dr. Reeves cannot hide his feelings from us, but he can surprise us with their depth and complexity. His emotional patterns reveal layers that take time to understand, mysteries that unfold gradually rather than being immediately apparent. She looked directly at Alexis, her gaze intense enough to make him grateful that his hair wasn't still glowing. Tell me, Doctor, what is it like to love someone without being certain they return your feelings? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Alexis felt trapped between honesty and self-preservation, aware that anything he said would be analyzed by beings whose entire culture was built on emotional transparency. Terrifying, he said finally. But also, hopeful. There's something beautiful about caring for someone without expectation, about choosing to be vulnerable without guarantee of reciprocation. And if you knew, with absolute certainty, how they felt about you, then it wouldn't be love, he replied, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. It would be transaction. Love requires faith, risk, the possibility of disappointment. Without uncertainty, it becomes just biological programming. Queen Valera smiled, and for the first time since he'd known her, the expression seemed completely unguarded. Precisely. Our emotional transparency has eliminated mystery from relationships, but mystery is what makes connection meaningful. This is highly irregular, Methvar protested. You're advocating for deception, for hiding truths that could prevent suffering. I'm advocating for choice, she corrected. The choice to reveal feelings gradually, to maintain privacy, to experience the uncertainty that makes discovery worthwhile. And what of our people's stability? Our social harmony? Will survive the introduction of a little romantic uncertainty, she replied firmly. In fact, it might benefit from it. The council session continued for another hour, with debates about protocol, precedent, and the potential sociological implications of allowing emotional privacy aboard a Zephyrian vessel. Alexis found himself the subject of intense academic discussion, as if he were a particularly interesting anthropological specimen whose behavior patterns might revolutionize their understanding of relationship dynamics. When the counselors finally departed, Queen Valera remained on her throne, looking thoughtful. The throne room's walls had returned to their usual gentle pulsing, reflecting the ambient emotional resonance of its occupants. "Dr. Reeves," she said eventually, "I have a proposition for you. I'm almost afraid to ask. I want to try something that no member of my species has attempted in over 3 centuries. I want to voluntarily suppress my emotional resonance abilities for a limited time. Is that possible? Theoretically. We have the technology, though it has never been used except in medical emergencies. I want to experience what your people call uncertainty in relationships." Alexis stared at her, trying to process the implications. "You want to, not know how I feel about you. I want to discover it gradually, the way your people do. I want to wonder, to hope, to take emotional risks without certainty." She paused, her expression vulnerable in a way he'd never seen before. "I want to experience what it means to fall in love with mystery intact." The neural suppression chamber hummed with the kind of energy that made Alexis's teeth ache and his hair stand on end, though thankfully it wasn't glowing this time. Queen Valera lay on the biomedical platform, crystalline interfaces attached to her temples while displays showed the gradual dampening of her emotional resonance capabilities. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" Dr. Kethnal, the ship's chief medical officer, hovered nervously over the controls. "Voluntarily suppressing your natural abilities goes against every medical protocol we have. Which is exactly why it's necessary," the Queen replied, her voice steady despite the obvious discomfort the procedure was causing. "How can we truly understand other species if we insist on experiencing them only through our own biological advantages?" Alexis watched the readouts with growing anxiety. What if something goes wrong? What if the suppression causes permanent damage? "Then I'll spend the rest of my life experiencing relationships the way humans do," she said with a smile that was only slightly strained. "Given what I've observed of your emotional complexity, that might not be entirely unfortunate." The medical chamber's walls pulsed with concerned bioluminescence, reflecting the anxiety of everyone present. Even the maintenance symbionts seemed agitated, clustering around the chamber's base and making those wind chime gargling sounds that Alexis had learned indicated distress. "Emotional resonance at 60% and declining," Dr. Kethnal announced. "Neural pathway suppression proceeding normally." "How does it feel?" Alexis asked. "Like losing a sense I've had since birth," Queen Valera replied, her brow furrowing with concentration. "The world is becoming quieter. I can no longer feel the emotional currents of the crew, the subtle harmonics that tell me their state of mind. It's like suddenly going deaf, but for feelings rather than sound." 40% resonance, the doctor continued. "Your Majesty, we can stop the process at any point if you change your mind." "Continue," she said firmly, though Alexis noticed her hands gripping the platform's edges with increasing tension. Velthara, who had been observing from the chamber's entrance, stepped forward with obvious concern. "Your Majesty, the Council is requesting confirmation that this procedure is being conducted under your full authority. Apparently, there are protocols about voluntary sensory impairment that tell the Council that their Queen is exploring new frontiers in diplomatic understanding," Queen Valera interrupted. "If they have concerns, they can discuss them with me after I've completed this experiment in emotional blindness." 20% resonance, Dr. Kethnal announced. "Neural suppression nearly complete." Alexis, the queen said suddenly, reaching out toward him. Come here. He moved to her side, taking her hand carefully. Her skin felt different somehow, as if some essential energy had been drained from it. I want you to know, she continued, her voice growing softer, that I chose this not because I doubted my feelings, but because I wanted to experience yours the way your people do. Without certainty. Without the safety of knowing in advance. 10% resonance. 5%. Suppression complete. The chamber fell silent except for the gentle hum of life support systems. Queen Valera sat up slowly, blinking as if adjusting to different lighting, though nothing had changed in the room's illumination. How do you feel? Alexis asked. Blind, she replied simply. For the first time in my life, I have no idea what anyone in this room is feeling. Dr. Kethnal could be terrified, Velthara could be amused, and you. She looked at him with an expression of wonder and uncertainty. You could be feeling anything at all, and I have no way of knowing. Is it frightening? Terrifying, she admitted. And absolutely wonderful. Dr. Kethnal cleared his throat diplomatically. Your Majesty, I should inform you that the suppression is temporary. The neural pathways will begin regenerating within 72 hours, and full resonance capabilities should return within a week. A week of emotional mystery, she mused, standing on slightly unsteady legs. I wonder if that will be enough time to understand what I've been missing. Probably not, Alexis said honestly. Human relationships take years to develop, decades to fully understand. A week is barely enough to scratch the surface. Then we'd better make the most of it. They left the medical chamber together, walking through corridors that seemed different now that Queen Valera could no longer sense the emotional currents of her crew. Several Zephyrians they passed looked concerned, their ear jewelry chiming with agitation as they realized their queen was no longer responding to their unconscious emotional broadcasts. This is going to cause chaos in the Truth Singers, Velthara observed as they made their way toward the queen's private quarters. They rely on your emotional resonance to maintain harmonic balance during their sessions. Then they'll have to learn to find balance without relying on external authority, Queen Valera replied. Perhaps that's overdue anyway. Her quarters were larger than Alexis's but decorated with the same organic aesthetics that characterized the rest of the ship. Living walls pulsed gently with bioluminescence, while furniture grew from the deck in graceful curves that accommodated Zephyrian physiology. What caught his attention, however, was how different the space felt without the Queen's emotional presence filling it. I need to ask you something, she said once they were alone, settling onto a chair that molded itself to her form. And I need you to answer honestly, because I can no longer sense whether you're being truthful. What is it? Do you love me? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Alexis felt his heart racing, aware that this moment would define everything that followed. Without her empathic abilities, she truly couldn't know his feelings unless he chose to reveal them. Yes, he said simply. I love you. I've loved you since that first diplomatic meeting when you laughed at my comment about cranial appendages. I love your curiosity, your willingness to challenge your own people's assumptions, your courage in trying something that terrifies you just to understand a different way of being. Her smile was radiant, but he could see uncertainty beneath it. And how do I know you're not simply telling me what you think I want to hear? You don't, he replied. That's the point. Love requires faith. Faith, she repeated the word as if tasting it. Such a foreign concept to my people. We've eliminated the need for faith by making all emotions transparent. And in the process, you've eliminated the possibility of surprise, of discovery, of the kind of trust that has to be earned rather than simply verified. She stood and moved to one of the living walls, placing her palm against its surface. The bioluminescence responded to her touch, but without the emotional resonance that would normally create complex patterns. Instead, it simply glowed with steady warmth. I find myself wondering, she said without turning around, whether my feelings for you are genuine or simply the result of novelty. Your emotional complexity was so different from what I was accustomed to that perhaps I mistook fascination for attraction. And now I have to discover the truth the way your people do. Through time, through experience, through the gradual revelation of compatibility or its absence. A soft chime indicated an incoming communication, and Velthara's voice filled the room. Your Majesty, the Council is requesting an emergency session. Apparently, your neural suppression has created some unexpected effects throughout the ship. What kind of effects? The truth singers are composing what they're calling uncertainty ballads. The maintenance symbionts have begun creating elaborate artistic displays in the corridors, and several crew members are reporting the novel experience of having to guess what their colleagues are thinking. Queen Valera exchanged glances with Alexis. It sounds like my experiment in emotional privacy is having broader implications than anticipated. Should we be concerned? He asked. Probably, she replied with obvious delight. Change is rarely comfortable, but it's often necessary. They made their way to the council chamber, where the assembled Zephyrians were engaged in what appeared to be their species' equivalent of animated debate. Without the Queen's emotional resonance to provide subtle guidance, the council members were having to rely on actual verbal communication, which seemed to be creating both confusion and unexpected creativity. Your Majesty, Councillor Methvar rose as they entered, we must discuss the implications of your current condition. The crew is experiencing unprecedented levels of emotional uncertainty. Are they suffering? She asked. Not exactly. But they're having to communicate in ways they haven't used since childhood. Some find it liberating, others find it terrifying. Sounds like growth, Alexis observed, earning sharp looks from several counselors. The human makes a valid point, Queen Valera said. Perhaps our people have become too dependent on emotional transparency. A little uncertainty might encourage more thoughtful communication. But what about efficiency? Decision-making? The smooth operation of ship systems? We'll adapt, she replied firmly. Humans manage to operate complex civilizations without telepathic empathy. I suspect we can manage a week of emotional privacy without societal collapse. The session continued for hours, with debates about precedent, protocol, and the potential long-term effects of introducing uncertainty into Zephyrian social structures. Alexis found himself serving as an unofficial consultant on human relationship dynamics, explaining concepts like courtship, romantic surprise, and the gradual revelation of emotional intimacy. When the council finally adjourned, Queen Valera and Alexis walked through corridors that buzzed with new kinds of energy. Crew members were engaged in actual conversations rather than simply sharing emotional harmonics, while the truth singers had evolved their meditations into what sounded like speculative philosophy set to music. I have something to confess, Queen Valera said as they reached her quarters. What's that? I'm not entirely certain I love you either. Alexis felt a stab of disappointment, followed immediately by curiosity. What do you mean? I mean that without my empathic abilities, I'm discovering that I need time to understand my own feelings as well as yours. What I interpreted as love might have been fascination, or attraction, or simple intellectual stimulation. She paused at her doorway, turning to face him directly. But I know that I want to find out. I want to spend time discovering whether what I feel is genuine affection or merely the novelty of encountering someone I couldn't immediately understand. And if it turns out to be just fascination? Then we'll have learned something valuable about the difference between attraction and love, she replied. And if it turns out to be something deeper, then we'll have earned it through choice rather than simply accepting it as biological inevitability. Alexis nodded slowly, understanding flooding through him. So where does this leave us? In exactly the same place your people always find themselves at the beginning of a relationship, she said with a smile that held equal parts nervousness and anticipation. Uncertain, hopeful, and willing to risk disappointment for the possibility of something genuine. I know you're deceiving me, she continued, her voice soft but certain, hiding depths of feeling that I can no longer detect. But I still choose you. I choose the uncertainty, the mystery, the possibility of being surprised by love rather than simply confirming its biological presence. As weeks passed and her empathic abilities gradually returned, Queen Valera chose not to use them to probe Alexis's feelings. Instead, she allowed their relationship to develop naturally, through conversation, shared experiences, and the gradual revelation of compatibility. Their union became a symbol of a new kind of diplomacy between species, one based on chosen trust rather than verified honesty. The Zephyrian Empire began experimenting with limited emotional privacy in certain contexts, while human colonies started exploring technologies that might allow for greater emotional understanding. And in the end, Alexis realized that the most profound discovery hadn't been about alien technology or diplomatic protocol, but about the courage required to love without certainty, to choose vulnerability over safety, and to find that sometimes the most meaningful connections are built not on what we know about each other, but on what we choose to discover together.